Next up, the Global Leaders Roundtable by Ecosystem, where we will hear from entrepreneurs, policymakers, investors, corporates, academia, and NGOs as they discuss the changes society needs to drive to create a quick and long-lasting global solution to climate change. Moderating this diverse panel is Amit Gupta, Chief Executive Officer and founder of Ecosystem, a next generation technology research and advisory platform. We'll welcome back High Commissioner Joe Tyndall to join Amit, together with Bradley Bussetto, Director of United Nations Development Programme Global Centre for Tech, Innovation and Sustainability, Hari V. Krishnan, Managing Director and Group Chief Executive Officer of Property Guru Group, Chief Executive Officer of Carbon Click, Dave Rouse, Encitech Production Founder Rakesh Rao, and Michelle Lee, Chief Executive Officer of AMTD Digital. We'll head on over to Amit and to join his panelists for this discussion now.
Mr. Amit, please speak.
Welcome to another Impact session at the Singapore FinTech Festival. What a wonderful way to kick off this session with that glimpse of through that film. And we actually have the award-winning documentary filmmaker joining us, amongst us, as to actually stir this an excellent conversation all around. So welcome everyone. Welcome to my fellow panelists. I'm really looking forward to a great conversation. I just wanted to start with the fact that, we realize the world has changed around us over the last 9 months, and it's shown us how vulnerable we are as human beings. But there is a silver lining to this dark cloud, and the silver lining is the fact that when humanity is pushed to its limit, we show our resilience best. And we have the ability to band together as people, as communities, as nations. And the key here is the collective effort. And while COVID has been a watershed moment in itself, we have also managed to squeeze in years of societal shifts into a matter of weeks. And it's perhaps an opportunity for us to reconsider whether we can do a hard reset in our way of life to solve arguably what is the biggest foundational shifts of them all, climate change. So today I'm privileged to have with us leaders who are actually putting their own stamp in their own ways and trying to bring the right conversations that actually drive actions and actions that will actually bring about change and change for the betterment of humanity and the planet. Not new to this subject at all. In her previous role as New Zealand's climate change ambassador at the UN, she played a critical role in framing what became the Paris Agreement. So, we look forward to your perspectives, High Commissioner. We have Bradley Bocetto, director of the UNDP's Global Center for Technology, Innovation, and Sustainability. Um, he's been a pioneer in creating and scaling innovative financing and business model solutions for creating a better, more sustainable world. We have Hari Krishnan, Group CEO of Property Guru, the region's leading real estate platform. Can't think of a better individual who's got a bird's eye view of the entire real estate sector to actually tell us what are the challenges we are facing and what is being done to address some of these issues that we're dealing with. We also hear from the award-winning documentary filmmaker whose film you actually just saw a glimpse of, The Climate Challenge, which has won numerous awards. And we hope to hear from and spending time in the Arctic Circle, in the Antarctica, and the Himalayas, joining climate scientists as look forward to that discussion. Okay, and we also have Michelle Lee, the CEO of AMTD Digital. Michelle is a very passionate fintech leader who actually views the opportunity for digital banking to actually put a stake in the ground and take a lead in driving greater accessibility and choices for consumers, regulators, and industry towards managing their carbon footprint. And finally, we rounded off with an exceptional Kiwi entrepreneur, Dave Rouse, the CEO of Carbon Click. They're a unique fintech that brings accessibility and choices to businesses and individuals, helping them with their carbon offsets, literally with one click. So welcome, everyone, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation.
Thank you.
All right, so Rakesh, since we saw your film, we've been inspired by it. I thought let me start with you because I'd want to get a sense of the hard, cold reality of what's actually transpiring at the moment. So there are things that we are aware of, but there are a lot of things that you have seen that we've not seen. So I'd love to get your perspective just to kick it off. What are those things that you've seen that we're not seeing, and what should we be thinking of as we plan ahead?
Thanks, Amit, for first of all for having me here, and it's so good to see all of you. And it's so great that we're talking on a very interesting and a very important topic today, climate change and trying to find out solutions. Well, as a science and expedition photographer and filmmaker, I've got this opportunity of being on numerous expeditions to some of the most hostile and most extreme places on this earth, to the cryospheric polar regions of Arctic, Antarctic, Himalayas, and also did some sailing in the Southern Ocean. Along with the best part was that I did these expeditions on a scientific expedition with scientists on board. So when you are there with them and when they churn out the data and they get their instruments and the data come out, and then when they interpret and you discuss with them, and you also, of course, you talk to the locals in the Arctic and you hear, you start getting the telltale signs of climate change. And there are still skeptics. It's unfortunate there are still skeptics who still deny climate change, but it's very much happening out there. Like for instance, in the Arctic, when you're there and you see some of the satellite imagery or archival photographs of some of the glaciers, and now when you see them today, they're like receded 5-6 kilometers into inland, and they're some of the fastest receding glaciers. That hits you when you're there. And moreover, when you talk to a local and even the local scientists out there, who used to tell that during winters they used to actually cross over the fjord because it used to freeze. And from almost a decade now, the fjord doesn't freeze because of warming waters, and the sea ice is not it's not in the full proportion what it used to happen some years back. I mean, it's even startling to see that even the remotest areas in the Arctic has scientists are now finding almost 12,000 microplastics per liter of sea ice. I mean, it's only indications of telling what we as humans have done to this planet, and it's pretty strange. And this phenomenon is just not only in the Arctic; it's all across. Whether it's in the Himalayas, you see the glaciers happening out there, receding very fast. You see the permafrost thawing. The oceans are getting warmer and acidic. The sea levels are rising. I mean, there are multiple things what the climate change is doing to us.
No, fantastic. And I don't know if anyone has any points to add to that, but I do want to actually pose a question to the High Commissioner because you've been very intrinsically involved in a lot of the policy making, and I actually love your statement that I've heard in some of your previous sessions. And if I can quote you, High Commissioner, what you've said is, "We have the rules, the tools, and the technology to take action." Um, would you help just elaborate and give us perspective on that?
Yeah, and I think yes, just what we've been hearing really reinforces it beggars belief that, frankly, that there are still climate deniers out there. I know there are, but the evidence is all around us, and it's there in even the most pristine parts of the world, like the Deep South. Talking to a climate scientist down there just the other day. But yes, I think that climate change, it's obvious it's a global problem that can't be resolved unless we all work together. And it's pretty obvious that emissions don't respect national boundaries. And it's also a deep irony that quite often it's those who have emitted the least that are suffering the worst of the impacts of climate change. If you think of small, low-lying Pacific islands or those in the path of increasing storms in the Caribbean or wherever. But solving climate change means a huge, massive economic transformation that moves the world from reliance on fossil fuels that literally have driven our economies for the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution. And no government is keen to make the adjustments necessary on their own. It's kind of political suicide, really, to make that adjustment if you're out there in the wilderness with nobody else behind you. So you need an international treaty, and you need to have an international treaty that is one that it is feasible and viable to join. That way, governments can see that there's some peer pressure and demonstrate that to domestic audiences who might be somewhat reluctant to see them take action. Look, we're all in this together. Other people are doing the same thing, so we can all go ahead. So the Paris Agreement ticked all the boxes, in my view. It sets collective global goals for the world to reach by the middle of this century, fast approaching. It allows the governments to nationally determine, to set their own targets, what they are prepared to commit to do. It creates those rules I was talking about to ensure emissions are measured and reported, and governments are held to account for the actions they take. And it sort of sets up a system for continuous improvement and enhanced ambition through a 5-yearly global stocktake. So that was a massive achievement, I think, in 2015 when the French foreign minister at the time, Laurent Fabius, gavelled through the Paris Agreement with huge support from 195 or 96 parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's what I mean. We've got the rules. That's the first part. And that Paris Agreement sent a really strong political signal, especially to business. This is the policy direction for the future. This is where the world is going. And it gave business time and the kind of stability or policy certainty to plan for the future. I reckon the world is like most of us at school with homework assignments or tests coming up or whatever. We tend to leave things rather to the last minute instead of being well planned. So it would have been great to have had this global treaty much earlier, but it's great that we got it in 2015. I could probably talk for another hour on where to from there, but I think that really set us up well for the business sector and for consumers generally to start, the public generally, to start thinking about climate change as an issue for which we each need to take personal responsibility. So you kind of had signals coming from the top down, you had signals coming from the bottom up, and it's really, I think, hate to use the climate term avalanche, it's kind of set the ball rolling, and the speed, the momentum of change is going to grow exponentially. It will not be linear, it will grow exponentially, and by golly, it needs to.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting. You talked about learning, and the reality is that as human beings, we are born with 8 types of natural intelligences, and we don't all have those 8. I won't rattle off all 8 of them. One of them is music. I don't have that intelligence. I think I'm not very good with that. But the one of them is environmental intelligence and awareness around you of your surroundings. And unfortunately, only 5% of the people are actually born with that as a natural intelligence. But that's no different from learning physics in school, because we weren't born with that knowledge, but we learned that. And I'm hoping that with the steps that are being taken, that there's enough learning that's created and people are actually able to absorb that and become more aware and start to bring a change. So talking about the UN, you mentioned the UN. We've got Bradley here, is the head of the UNDP's Global Center for Technology, Innovation, and Sustainable Development. So big ask in your hand, on your hands, Bradley. If I can, could we get a perspective from you on, what role is the UN playing in this, and what's currently being done, and what should we be expecting?
Thanks, Amit, and great to be here with you again, and to be with such distinguished speakers on this, timely but most crucial topic really for the world. So yeah, maybe to go back to what the High Commissioner was talking about in terms of the treaty, maybe a bit of the global perspective. Unfortunately for me and for us, the UN Secretary General just gave a very important speech on this topic a few days ago. I wanted to pick out a couple of points from that. It was noted because it was actually quite optimistic, and there are sort of 3 key priorities that he laid out for not just for the UN but for the world to really take action, and noted too that before getting into it that the 15 countries that are kind of most susceptible to climate change, kind of pointing out the inequities of climate change, 15 countries most susceptible to climate change that are most hammered by drought and by flooding and hunger, for example, are those that have the most peacekeeping missions. It's also clear that those countries around the world that emit the least, are the ones that are suffering the most. But he pointed out 3 priorities for the world, prefacing it by saying, there's no vaccine for the planet, so we have to think differently. The first focus was on carbon neutrality, and there's going back to what the High Commissioner Tyndall has noted in terms of treaties and commitments. There is some good news there. 110 countries have committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. Recently, Japan and United Kingdom and Korea have signed up. And and so that has to, accelerate even more. Think about how to move away from coal-fired plants to renewables, of course. And more than it's clear now though that it's moving from the old economy to a new economy, and so do countries, do people want to be left behind? And it's clear too that renewables create kind of net positive to the GDPs, but also create a lot more jobs too. So there's an economic benefit. It's not just a planetary benefit to all this. And we're seeing some other interesting signs here in terms of carbon neutrality. Denmark has recently pledged to cease all oil and gas production in the next few years, and that's not just about carbon neutrality. That's much broader. Similar big producers in Europe making similar commitments. But so beyond carbon neutrality, the second major point is around aligning global finance around the Paris Accords. And what that means is really putting a price on carbon. I mean, a real price on carbon. Stop building coal power plants. And kind of aligning finance with the SDGs. And one big thing, of course, is to figure out how to decarbonize investments, right? So how especially the large asset owners, and especially the $32 trillion that are in pension funds. Again, there's a great example in Denmark where the biggest pension fund in Denmark is not pledging carbon neutrality, but trying to be net negative. In other words, pulling out more emissions from the air than less. And there, Japan has made great strides there too. The Japan Pension Fund moving towards ESG investing. But so it's the carbon neutrality and the treaties and getting the governments moving, getting the finance aligned. And the third is around really kind of a technological moonshot around climate adaptation, right? So how do you just protect countries and communities and cities, make them more resilient to the inevitable climate change that's going to happen anywhere? And that's where we have to look for solutions. We don't have easy answers there. How do we make coasts more resilient? How do we make crops more resilient and so forth? So this is kind of the bigger context here. And the UN plays roles in all three of these areas, but especially focused on, of course, on countries with sort of poorer resource settings to begin with that are most vulnerable. But wanted to give that sort of global picture here. There is optimism. We know what to do. I think there's optimism to the Secretary General because of what some governments have done over the past few years and past few weeks, but also the popular will that's come up over the last year, especially. But maybe been prodded by the pandemic to a large extent.
Yeah. Thank you, Bradley. And look, I think it comes down to the will of the industry. It's not just the regulators, not just the policymakers, but obviously the industry, and then eventually the consumers. I mean, and we've got three very distinguished folks here actually making a difference in their own ways, because the climate change actions have to not just come top down; they have to be bottom up as well from the consumers. So, Hari, if I could ask you from an industry perspective, I know that your company has recently done a study on consumer sentiment around sustainable options, and what we'd like to understand is where does that actually fall? Is this a criteria that sits within the must-have for people, or is there a lot of work to be done to move it from good to have to must-have?
Yeah, thank you, Amit. Thanks for asking us. I think at Property Guru, we run these consumer sentiment studies just to understand what property seekers are looking for when they look for residential real estate. And we've been doing this for the last decade or so, every 6 months. I think what's been interesting is in the last 18 months or so, we're seeing a consistent trend of sustainability coming up as a criteria. So it's not something that we necessarily prod. It's something that consumers are surfacing of their own volition. And I think you're seeing, specific areas, whether it be cooling, whether it be solar panels. Now, a lot of this is coming from obviously consumers getting more educated about, their options and, what's going to happen to their communities and their neighborhoods, their cities, their countries if they don't make these choices. And they're definitely willing to do so. I think in Singapore, for instance, our latest study indicated that property seekers are actually willing to pay a premium for sustainably built homes, as long as it's clear and measurable. But I guess one of the questions is, we discussed earlier in this roundtable that, there are climate change deniers. But I think one of the additional challenges is that sustainable solutions are often more expensive. And I think as an industry, we need to start taking away this pricing tension around sustainability. Why is it more expensive? That sort of creates a huge challenge, particularly like if you look at in Southeast Asia, there are lots of people who are just beginning to join the property ladder. And if they're going to have to make that trade-off, it's a hard one. And, I mean, just as a data point, many people may not realize, but cement accounts for 8% of carbon dioxide emissions. So the construction sector is quite important if you're going to sort of drive this. Now, what you're beginning to see green loans, for example, for property developers. So financial institutions are willing to incentivize developers to make more sustainable decisions around construction. But I guess, and we do have a lot of interesting financial levers, everything from interest rates to financial incentives, the loan to value ratios, for instance, stamp duties. So there are lots of elements that can come in there. But we work in a sector which is already representing the most expensive asset class in existence, real estate. And there's this great opportunity to drive better behaviors from the consumers. Consumers are beginning to show interest in this as well. But I guess, and in some ways, I'd almost throw it back to folks who might know a little bit more in the sector, potentially the High Commissioner or Bradley. I guess the question is, are governments sort of willing to do this? There's this sort of interest. And to your point, Amit, if I'm being completely honest, it's nice to have right now in the property sector. If the consumers are much more interested in the affordability, location, your classic property attributes. But now you're beginning to see this thing come up. And I think what's going to take it from nice to have to must have, frankly, is going to be financial incentives. It's a really expensive asset class. Unless we make it interesting to them, they are not going to actually demand sustainably built homes, at least in this part of the world.
Yeah.
Could I make just a couple of points in response to that, since you asked? I think a couple of things. If you look at renewable energy as an example, the cost curve for most forms of renewable energy has just dropped dramatically as technology and the use has increased. So I think you do see cost curves start to come down. And now renewable energy is completely cost competitive with fossil fuels as a form. You're going to see the same thing with electric vehicles as they start to become more pervasive around the world and infrastructure for charging and everything gets built up. The next point I think it's really important for consumers to start to think about is not just the purchase price of whatever it is, a piece of property or a car or a whatever it might be, but the kind of life cycle cost, where if you are in a sustainably built property, your energy costs are going to be a lot lower. Same with an electric vehicle, which you're plugging in. So you might be paying more upfront, a bit of a premium, but you should have an asset that costs you less over the life, its whole lifetime. Governments vary. Some of them are happy to provide some form of financial incentive. Others are philosophically not that way inclined, but governments do have a variety of policy tools that can influence or encourage consumer behaviour in one direction or another, which may not be, they may be regulatory rather than, a financial incentive, for example.
High Commissioner, thank you. Actually, I do want to come back to you in a few minutes with a point specifically addressing Hari's question, the fact that our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who, by the way, will be speaking in about 19 minutes, is declared a climate emergency in Parliament a few days ago in New Zealand. And what that meant was all government vehicles would be electric vehicles from going forward, and all buildings have to be compliant with green certification. So I think that's a fantastic step. I do want to come back to you with that, High Commissioner, because I do think this topic of electric vehicles is a great example where it's not just the cost, but sustainable solutions were expected to be. In one of the conversations, High Commissioner, you and I have had, they were dull and boring, but now obviously things are changing. They can be exciting. We've got to make it more exciting. Electric vehicles is a great example of that. You look at Tesla, but now you look at the mainstream performance car brands. And I know you do like your fast cars, and we'll come back to that on that. But I want to talk about consumer empowerment, because that's what Michelle and Dave do, in their fields. So Michelle, do you think there's enough awareness within consumers, and what can be done to actually create that level of awareness to bring about change?
Yeah. So I agree with Harry's survey results. If you look at any survey on consumers in terms of awareness, it would point to a percentage in the range of like 50-60% of them would prefer eco-friendly brands, products in the developed countries, right? But the problem is there's still a huge intention-action gap. So only a few of them, just minimal number of them, are willing to make the action, willing to pay the premium. For the one concern, of course, is the price, right? The premium price required. The second is the options offered to the consumers. I mean, in the consumer goods segment, there are probably more options for consumers, but for properties, probably not so much. And in financial services, you don't have that much product linked to eco-friendly product to consumers. Think about when do you see a loan says this is an eco-friendly loan, right? Or when do you see an insurance product says this has environment impact in it, right? No, there's no such option. I mean, also there's lack of tools for consumers to track their carbon footprint in general in any financial platforms. So that's why I think, first of all, we need to offer them the accessibility to the tools and products. So for example, our MTD's partner, Singapore Power, so they are the power company in Singapore, right? So they just launched a very interesting function that the consumers, they can track their carbon footprint, their SP group account, so through their energy consumptions. The SMEs can do so as well. Also, in addition to that, SP in the app, they also offered green credit, meaning the consumers, they can purchase the green certificate from renewable energy projects. So that's an option for the consumers, right? They already have the awareness, they just don't have the tools. So this can be, this product, these options can be easily plugged in any bank's APIs, right? So we can just use the SP's APIs to track their carbon footprint of the energy consumption. Also, the bank can do more. For example, the bank can help the consumer to track the carbon footprint of each of their credit card consumption. I don't see that option often now, but I think it's a trend going forward. In addition, I think the banks can offer the consumers ways to offset the carbon footprint as well, like what SP is doing, right? In addition, I think there are more and more tools to make the green bonds investment available to consumers. Right now, green bonds, Harry, you talked about there are more green bonds issued by property developers, but those green bonds, they are only available to institutional investors. The minimum investment size is actually $200K US. It's a lot for consumers, but currently there are technology companies to fractionalize those green bonds, make them available. The minimum investment can be as small as 1,000 USD. So that's a great tool for the consumers to tap into this green bond market, right? So that's great. Also, I think on the issuer side, now more and more companies are starting to use the blockchain to issue their green bonds. So it's a great way to help them to reduce the issuance cost. It means a lot for smaller issuers, actually. So they encourage smaller companies to issue green bonds as well, not just limited to bigger companies.
Yeah. I thank you, Michelle, and I'm hoping that with the generational shift. Sorry, Bradley, you wanted to make a point.
Both to Michelle and thanks, Amit. So yes, Michelle's point about sort of new apps and technologies that are helping the consumer figure out their carbon footprint. I mean, there are lots of it, like Carbon Click with us today, for example, helping track carbon offsets. But also there's a cool one out of something called Green Assets Wallet. I'm not sure if you know about that one, but using blockchain technology to make green bonds easier to understand, more transparent, and so forth. And then back on the ambassador's point too. So we need to think about the cost, and maybe Harry's point, the cost of sustainability from a planetary sense in a way, right? And so, in fact, the UN is coming out with its new Human Development Report, which shifts all of this and looks at human development through a kind of planetary lens. And so, but that sort of that mind shift in the consumer to think about cost in that way, it's a long journey, but it's starting to happen. It's starting to happen in a few countries and a few populations. So I wouldn't be too pessimistic of it happening right around here in Singapore and beyond, in Southeast Asia too. If the different forces converge in the right way.
And look, and to that point, the generational shift is going to have a huge impact. If you look at the new generation that's coming out, and they're going to come into the workforce, they're going to have the purchasing power, and the purchasing power we know with each generation goes up, hopefully, right? And they're a lot more aware of the values they want to see with brands.
Yeah.
Brands are starting to become aware. So hopefully, sustainability isn't going to be something that sits on the sidelines of a corporate, a CSR initiative. It's not a corporate social responsibility initiative, but core, front and center that makes business sense. So, I think it's a great way to kind of get a sense from Dave, who's actually empowering these consumers. It'd be great to get a sense of how, from your own statistics of users, whether you see a generational pattern there, Dave. But do you think, as a starting point, do you think consumers need to be more demanding in terms of what they want?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing it with I'm glad you mentioned generational change. With the millennials in particular, they're really strong in the sustainability movement and they are talking with their wallets. Unfortunately, they don't make up a big enough part of the market to act alone. So what we rely on is for the generations ahead of them, their parents, to actually follow the same principles. And Michelle mentioned it really nicely. I think it's that pricing tension. Harry mentioned the pricing tension there. That's what we need government assistance and business assistance to actually support, and that can come through government policy, but also through, for every one government there are thousands, if not millions, of businesses. The influence over them is strong, but the businesses need to participate and they need to take a lead on it as well. For every business, there are hundreds of consumers that they have an influence over. So we kind of do rely on all of the businesses to do their part. So if you, Amit, are not doing your part, the system is broken. And until you do, the system will remain broken. We need you to do your part. I need to do my part, or we will never get where we need to go. And I liken this to a collision course that the Titanic is on towards the iceberg, or I think our High Commissioner Joe Tyndall mentioned the avalanche. Those are really good analogies for where we're heading. It is exponential, and we do need this urgency to come on. I don't think COVID has done us too many favours in one sense, like we've deferred COP until Edinburgh next year, but on the other sense, it's shown us that we can act globally to address a big problem quickly. We can stop, we can reduce our travel, and we can live differently. So that's really helpful. And looping back to your question, what's the consumer movement doing? It's growing significantly. So in the millennial bracket, the climate concerns have grown about 25% in the last 12 months. So it was a major growth with Greta Thunberg last year as well. So that's growing really rapidly, and these guys are becoming more affluent, and they're spending and doing their research on on companies that they are supporting, and they're changing their spending habits.
Yeah, and the problems, though. Sorry, Rakesh.
Yeah, I mean, what Dave is saying is perfect. And in fact, what I feel is that the pandemic has taught us so many things. And what we just need to do is probably multiply it 1,000 times to actually combat the climate change. We have got all the, it's not that the countries were not together before, but now, apart from signing the agreement, we have also understood a mechanism of working together and getting things going. And it's really, and what I feel is that everybody is very much aware. I mean, the countries are aware, people are aware, the corporates are aware, industries are aware, consumers are aware that climate change is happening and things of that sort. The problem is that we are very slow in our act. It's like a person is dying and he needs a ventilator, and today we're asking him to wear a mask. That's not the speed that we need to work on. We need, and I'm really happy that the High Commissioner is here and the New Zealand has declared a climate emergency. And this trend has to go on to all the countries. And I also urge the people who are seen here today, I mean, with the industries folks tuned in, don't wait for the countries to come up with policies and implement and change a thing. I think it's a moral conscience that we all need to start adopting and start changing the way we behave and do some changes and go forward and take this climate change fight together.
No, fantastic. And look, to your point, climate change means different things to different people, right? It's a different set of problems in developed economies. It's a different set of problems in some other markets where people are actually struggling to just get food on the table. So we've got to be very realistic and not idealistic there. And one of the impacts of climate change, of course, is the disrupted crop patterns, because climate patterns impact crop patterns. So, Bradley, I wanted to get a perspective from you on what's being done to balance that out. How do we ensure that it's fair? We talk about smart cities, but we don't need smart cities in some parts of Africa. We just need food on the table. We need sustainability. How do we get to that?
Sorry, just unmuting. A super question. I mean, it was raised a bit earlier, sort of the inequity, sort of inherent inequity of all of this, right? Countries emitting more but suffering less in terms of the climate change crisis and how to really fix that. I mean, this is kind of the heart of what we're trying to do out of our center in Singapore is figure out technologies that don't cost tons and tons of money that can help with sustainability. And then so we're looking at, for example, the smart city approach that Singapore has adopted and trying to figure out how to create smart and sustainable cities in Africa. But we're not sort of taking the wholesale model from Singapore, which is hugely expensive and actually energy consumptive too. But working on things like how do we sort out, urban agriculture and sustainable agriculture in cities in Africa, right? So you reduce transport times and transport distances and therefore carbon emissions. Looking at things like that, looking at mobility patterns and figuring out new transport corridors for big cities. So looking at specific initiatives within specific cities to make them smarter and more sustainable without the high cost and without super whiz-bang technology that wouldn't be affordable. Looking at digitizing informal trade in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. Looking at digital ID in Timor-Leste. These are ways in which like the foundations for figuring out what sustainable urban spaces are like in these areas. So it can be done, and then kind of have to look at sort of archetypes for sustainable cities and sustainable urban areas that come from, from places like South America or from Africa or from South Asia that aren't necessarily tech driven, and those are the sort of models we're trying to adapt. But it just to say it is possible, but it takes a lot of concerted effort from the policy level, but also like just getting exposure to some of these technologies in some of these places.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and get into the exciting part. We did discuss that climate change solutions can be exciting. Electric vehicles, we talked about EVs. Hari, do we have the intent, or do we have currently and a plan or a blueprint to build an infrastructure that allows people to actually have electric vehicles and be able to, because you need charging stations. You can't, you need that facility, not just at home, but wherever you go. What's being done around that?
You're definitely seeing a lot more. I mean, if you look at the, I think I talk a lot about the fact that many of the cities that are being built in Asia are a collaboration between private enterprise and the public infrastructure. So you have these large townships which are self-contained, and private developers build the infrastructure within that, and they have definitely started optimizing for electric vehicle chargers and elements like that. You're beginning to see electrical EV chargers being designed for Southeast Asian conditions, for example, so extreme heat, extreme humidity. So you're not just importing things from the West, but understanding local conditions, getting the price point right, getting the environmental considerations right, so that the actual equipment works well. So you're beginning to see a lot more of this. Actually, one interesting thing that came up, which is not really tied to electric vehicles, but something that the High Commissioner said earlier, when you think about lifetime ownership of a real estate, one innovation that's come out of a small, so not-for-profit in this part of the world, Billion Bricks, is quite interesting, where they have sort of built a house that's built on, it's for those folks who are not part of, who are homeless or, the rural poor, essentially. And they're building these homes which have solar panels on the top of it. But what's interesting there is they've said that this can become an income source for the house owner. So it's taken what's become the most expensive cost for a household and made it into an income source. So if you look at the lifetime value of that home, now not only is it environmentally responsible because it's sort of using sustainable energy, but now it's become an income source. It's taken away the pricing tension, and this is an example of private enterprise not waiting for regulators to catch up, but essentially finding a way in which to break this paradigm where you have sustainable solutions which are more expensive. Now, the question is, can we make this more readily available to a broader segment of society, rather? But I think I did want to call out the fact that, addressing the huge number of people who are homeless, and since I speak for the real estate sector, is actually quite critical. And I think that's one of the more innovative solutions I've seen to taking a cost and making it actually into an income source.
Any thoughts from anyone on what more can be done going forward? I mean, we all can take ownership individually or as businesses. What more could be done? Anyone wants to?
Well, there's an enormous amount more, of course, that could be done. Amit, where to start? But I think one thing to bear in mind is that this is like sort of turning a huge cargo ship around. It's not something that can be turned on a dime, as it were. It's going to take a long time to get the shift in direction started. But what I meant about the Paris Agreement was that gives you the goal, and governments have sort of set their targets, but then they needed to underpin those targets with policies. And designing policies, whether it's carbon pricing or regulatory approaches or incentives or whatever it might be, for a whole range of different sectors across the economy, is something that is it can't be done in an instant. And certainly when you've got a democratic process, it also takes time. So I know that New Zealand's emissions still need a lot of work to get under control. But the fact that we put in place an emissions trading scheme, that we set up a green finance fund, that we declared the climate emergency a few days ago. We've passed a Zero Carbon Act to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. We've set up a climate commission to provide carbon budgets, advice to the government to act on. There's about to do some EV policy as well. So there's an enormous amount of policy going on. That's just in our little country. And there's many, many other countries in the world. We're trying to give assistance and advice to developing countries who have set targets, but then need the financial support and need the policy advice to help get it in place. So that, from a top-down perspective, I think is part of what the more that needs to be done. And once those policies are in place, it really helps, I think, both consumers and businesses to operate in a very clear, stable environment.
Absolutely. So, sorry, Brad.
Well, yeah, I mean, in a sense, the good news is that the blueprints are there. We have them, right? Like the blueprint of the Sustainable Development Goals, blueprint of the Paris Climate Accord, right? So at a policy level, and then the example of countries like New Zealand, right? From a policy perspective, there's guidance to follow. There's a blueprint. And also from a technological point of view, and from a financial point of view, there are solutions, right? So that's the good news. But it's about sort of merging that political policy with the consumer and the person.
So, thank you, Bradley. Thank you, everyone. We're looking forward to making some significant changes in our lifestyles and look forward to tremendous positive action. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amit, and fellow panelists, for a very engaging roundtable looking at long-lasting global solutions to climate change. Now, lots of good comments there. The fact that it's ultimately an ecosystem. It takes different partnerships all pulling in the same direction. Otherwise, no one is going to get anywhere fast. Thanks once again to Amit for moderating this session.